I think it's 8 a.m. in New Zealand. Am I correct?
Yeah, I've been up for a couple hours, so having a wonderful morning.
Or you're an early bird?
I can't help it. You get older, you do this bodybuilding thing long enough, eventually you just become increasingly boring. You're falling asleep on the couch at 9:30. Your wife's looking at you like, get a life, you know. So, oh, we got a
Well,
Max Coleman in the chat. What's up,
yeah,
man?
Coleman it all. I love that username.
Let's
By the
go.
by the way, by the way.
Mhm.
So how you been? Are you in week something of your prep? I know this because you share your training, and I saw a little line that says contest prep 2025, and I got excited. And oh, my man's going for it this year.
Yeah, no, I'm doing it. I'm doing it this year. This is the big year after having a proper pro off season because my pro debut was weeks after getting my pro card. And I wanted to really have the opportunity to try to like improve my physique, not just, you know, compete right after turning pro. And the only reason I haven't really like properly announced it is I want to do a new YouTube series vlog on 3DMJ, our YouTube, but Brandon, he just is in the middle of a move, along with Andrea. There are like content team, they do all the video editing, and we're trying to have a push to have a little better video editing. And I want to just wait till he's settled to start it. So it's going to be like, hey guys, I just started contest prep 2 months ago. It won't be that bad, but I have been technically dieting since the second week of April, but realistically, actually dieting for 3 weeks, maybe three and a half, because when I travel, I tend to accidentally diet. Um, it's just kind of what happens to me. And I was recently in the States. I did some collabs with RP. I was on the Tabletop podcast with Dave Tate, and I was also presenting at the Sports Nutrition Association conference. So, yeah, when I travel and when I'm talking and when I do things, like I get my nutrition in, but a lot of it's like my activity levels are higher than I anticipate, and I make sure I hit my protein, but sometimes I'm just making like very conscious food choices that probably are lower in calories than intended. So I came back like I think a kilo and a half lighter after that first week. So I got like that initial bloat drop that you get when you go off season to prep, and maybe another pound of fat loss down in that like first 10 days. So yeah, needless to say, I'm
Well,
essentially a month into contest prep.
I hope I didn't screw up by talking out loud and saying that you're in contest prep before the official
You
announcement one. So if you
spoiled it,
wish,
bro.
if you wish, I can cut this part to upload it to YouTube after this. I can make a cut here, and then we can move with the conversation as
Yeah,
you wish,
Brandon,
man.
edit it, please. Yeah, just I just assume he's always watching in the background everything I do. So
Oh no, no,
no, it's all
I
good.
mean, I mean when I upload this to YouTube, if you want me
I
to.
know. I was joking as though like Brandon was actually editing this live, like it was episode of Iron Culture. It didn't land, but
Ah, shit, man.
anyway,
Shit, man. I'm sorry. It's just my brain is being a little bit fried from studying actually the topic at hand, which is philosophy of science. I gotta
yeah,
tell you,
uh,
I've been on that since yesterday all morning. Here it's 2 p.m., so I'm a little fried. So please excuse my not getting your joke. I'm terribly sorry, man. I feel ashamed, really.
you should really honestly because if someone tells a joke and someone else doesn't understand it or doesn't land, it's the audience's fault. That's one thing I've learned.
Yeah.
So
Soon enough, you're gonna have to explain memes to me because by the rate that this is going, I don't see it coming to an end, man.
when you have a 42-year-old explaining memes to you, you know you've really lost touch with society, my friend.
I think I did. I think I just did this morning. I think well, well, first and foremost, as always, my man, it's always a pleasure. Thanks for taking the time, of course. Best of I don't want to say luck. I want to say crush it in your next competition. I'm gonna see you in the podium. I'm sure of that.
Thank
And
you.
I think we're leaving just to segue to the topic at hand because, of course, we want to respect your time. To quote the good Dr. Eduardo de Souza, we're living in
Mm.
strange times. It's kind of funny to me since I began using Instagram and other platforms to share and to learn about science. And nowadays, it seems like science it's a form of ideology, which is kind of paradoxical in a sense. So I wanted to ask you, just as a first question to kick off the conversation, What and because I watched your most well one of the most recent episodes of the Iron podcast, Iron Culture podcast, and also the Mass podcast with James Steele, which I found fascinating. I got to read the demise of the demarcation problem, other several papers that James cited, so that's why my brain is a little bit fried.
Wow.
So I wanted to ask you, why do you think having a background in philosophy of science specifically, it's important for coaches actually, and also for scientific communicators in this day and age? Because, well, it seems that we get more and more access to information. We get more and more papers on volume, on length and partials, whatever. But it doesn't seem that reason, it doesn't seem that common sense comes along with those papers, with that information. So I would love to hear your take on this current phenomena.
Yeah, I think it really comes down to the fact that people don't agree on what common sense is. And while that's a very colloquial way of putting it, what that really means is that people have, um, whether they realize it or not, fundamentally different perspectives on reality and knowledge. And um, the the unfortunate thing is that in quantitative fields of research, like sports science or medicine or anything like that, um, I wasn't, I'll speak for myself, taught the philosophy of science. Um, and that means that a term like ontology or epistemology or methodology, which you might have heard, but you probably misuse or think it's methods if you're in a quantitative sports science field, have not been introduced to you. You might have heard them opaquely or from someone else in a different degree program, or maybe if you took a philosophy course in your undergraduate or something like that. So we're just not even familiar with it. The closest thing to a philosophy of science course that most people who pursue a bachelor's of nutrition or exercise science or sports science get is what I would describe as a methods or a research methods class or a research paper class. And it basically teaches you, which is great, how to read research, how to understand research papers. You will get the basics of typically frequentist statistics that are used most commonly in sports science, but you aren't taught things like those terms I just mentioned that most people aren't familiar with. And I can understand why there's not an emphasis on that because it's not necessary to the occupation of being a sports scientist, nor is it necessary to the occupation of being an evidence-based practitioner or a coach. But it is becoming increasingly important if you are someone who's trying to consume information that is based on science, but seems to differ based upon people's interpretation of it. And the difference between two different interpretations can be very narrow. It might be that, say, myself and Eric Trexler, we disagree on the level of carbohydrate or protein that we would recommend in a certain circumstance, but it's because we value maybe, or like there's ambiguity to the evidence hierarchy, right? Um, Now that is a very minor difference in our own personal interpretation that we could probably, if we sat down and debated for a couple hours, come to a consensus. But it starts with us operating from essentially the same point from a epistemology and methodology perspective. And what epistemology means is um, like how can we know about the world? And then your methodology is how can we acquire that knowledge? What do we believe is the way that we can know things? Um, However, if you look at something I might say and looking at the same research and someone who says something completely different, the question is, well, what's going on there? And I think what's happening is whether implicitly or explicitly, we have fundamentally different beliefs about how to acquire knowledge and what constitutes the highest quality evidence. They may not even buy into the evidence hierarchy. And then the question is, well, why don't they buy into the evidence hierarchy? And you have to kind of track that back. Now, this is typically not an active process that most people engage with, and they sit down and they go, okay, well, what is my actual belief about the world? What's my ontology? What do I think there actually is to know? And then where do I sit from an epistemology standpoint, like what do I think is the best way to get knowledge? And then, I mean, there are fundamental disagreements if we look at philosophy on the degree to which we can even access the world and whether there is an objective world out there, right? And those are things I don't think most people realize. And they certainly haven't thought through in most cases, unless they have been trained in philosophy. So I'll back up a little bit. Sometimes we think of philosophy and science as not even in the same realm, right? Someone who goes and does a philosophy degree, someone who does a degree in biology, we'll just keep it a little simpler, different planets, different ways of thinking, never the two shall meet. But if we go back historically, um, all academic study was rooted in philosophy. And if we think about this from just a technological perspective, like there needed to be certain advancements before we could do more than just simple experiments in our heads. There were not always microscopes for us to know that there was a cell. When you think about philosophers from various different cultures, like Greek philosophy is an easy one because we're more familiar with it in the West. The four humors and just kind of going, oh, how could this work? Well, maybe this way. They're working backwards from what they are see and they know to be true, and they go, okay, how could this be? And it wasn't until we had actual methods to look at things in a more minute way and answer some of these fundamental questions about reality that we could start to disprove some of these philosophical postulations as to how the world works. But anyway, if we kind of fast forward to like the contemporary modern era, the study of anything in nature in a more quantitative way was called natural philosophy. Like Darwin was a natural philosopher, and that terminology became more specific, and we got things like, demarcations between, biology, zoology, etc., physics, and physics actually was kind of an umbrella term for all study of like the world and what happens. But I think a lot of people in the modern realm, they're just so disconnected from that history, they don't realize that our roots were actually in philosophy. And I think most people don't know that a PhD is a doctorate in philosophy on a given topic. So when someone says, I have a PhD in exercise science, what they're technically saying, whether they realize it or not, is that they have a doctorate in the philosophy of nutrition science. And while that's what it means, it rarely actually is demonstrated in the coursework or in the actual scientific study that the person does. Because most universities, when they have focused on a very quantitative field, have stepped completely away from the practice of teaching people the philosophy of science. And again, I am an example of one of those people. Everything that I am telling you, I have learned post PhD about the philosophy of science, or something I heard a little bit during my graduate work, but it wasn't something I was trained in per se. So you're basically getting the dime store James Steele today on this Instagram talk. But maybe it's helpful because I think Dr. Steele is someone who has immersed himself in that a lot more than I have, and I think I am, multiple levels below that in terms of how much I paid attention. But because I'm a science communicator, I see the value in it. And I've realized, oh, this is the root of some of the issues between why certain science communicators see things fundamentally in a different way and why there's these kind of ideological debates, like you say.
Man, if you're underground, I mean, if you're leveling down from steel, I think I'm really underground. I haven't even emerged yet, but I think it's really fascinating because, like you mentioned, and more so because today we use the term science and methodology without really knowing what is it about. And one thing, funny enough, one of my first career choices was philosophy. Then, for one thing or another, I got into fitness and in the sickness that is bodybuilding, sickness and also pleasure, it's kind of weird. It's a weird thing.
BDSM.
But but when we look at historically, like you mentioned, into through philosophy, there's really no separation. What is science? What is philosophy? It comes from the same thing, which is just knowledge. And then research, how do we acquire this knowledge and how do we apply this knowledge? And I think one of curiosities of exercise science and also nutrition is that it's not a fundamental science like it would be, you mentioned it, biology, mathematics, physics. It's an applied science. And I think one thing that you alluded in the conversation with James Steele, it's the demarcation problem. You mentioned it right now. But I think one of the fundamental things that we do not yet at least talk about in the fitness space in social media, it's induction and deduction. Taking into account that exercise science is an applied science, maybe we go from observation to patterns to hypothesis to a theory, induction. But according to Mr. Karl Popper, that would be not the right way, at least up to that point, because then we have the demise of the demarcation problem. In fundamental science, we go the other way, right? We go theory, we go hypothesis, we go observation, and then confirmation, which is funny because if we go to a gym, well, I'm observing the most jacked dude. I see that most jacked dudes train this way. So my hypothesis is that I need to train this way or do whatever they do. And then I have a theory. They are jacked because they do what they do, right?
Hmm.
So how do you come to terms with this as a science, as a scientist yourself, and also because you do both parts and do them as they do it, you do them both greatly, I would say, the scientific research and also the scientific communication. How do you come to terms with this fundamental, I would say, problem that we are not differentiating between these two?
Yeah. The difference between induction and deduction is it's very messy, and we are like we have little like pithy statements about it, like oh, correlation doesn't equal causation, and things that kind of get at the edges of this question, but we don't even actually realize. I'm not sure most people have been exposed to the specific definition of induction and deduction and thought about what the difference is. And I think one of the best examples of this sits at the heart of the modern conceptualization of sports science. So, like you said, we're an applied science, we're not a fundamental science, but I think arguably, if you want to be a good sports scientist, nutritionist, physiologist, you probably want to travel all the way back up to the point where you would say, which fundamental science are we closest to? And I'd say we're biologists, essentially, right? We're focused on human biology, and we're focused specifically on the interaction between the things we eat and the physical activities we do, and how that impacts our physiology for specific purposes. But when you think about it from kind of a bare bones perspective, um, what is going to have the longest tail of academic development? People thinking about how to think about things to learn things. Where should we go back the furthest? And that's going to be biology, right? So I think when you look at the evolution of exercise science came out of medical science, right? And then sports science kind of came out of a little bit of that, plus a scientific approach, or the best approximation of that we had for making athletes better at winning.
Yeah,
And this emerged kind of in parallel with the concept of periodization, which started in the 60s with Matveyev. And it's, I think, therefore shouldn't be surprising that one of the most contentious areas of debate is periodization, because the way periodization started was very inductive, right? It was, hey,
yeah,
athletes have been training for a while, they're pretty good, and some of these athletes are better than others. And if we look at which athletes are better than others and what things seem to be consistent among them, and then when we kind of lean into that more and create a system, maybe this is the way it should go. And let me start with some logical assumptions, and I'm matching that to the world around me, right? And there's value in that. But at the same time, it's not saying I'm going to start with a theory and then I'm going to try to test it and see if I can disprove it, right? Which is kind of the modern ideal goal of the way we do experiments in the quantitative field of sports science. So sports science really did, in my opinion, emerge parallel to periodization, and which has the broad meaning of just the process of training athletes in the long term. And I think when you look at the rationale and the justification, like claims made about periodization are often not based upon the best available evidence, right? Um, and this is an interesting thing, and James talked about this when we had him on the podcast, that emerging applied fields, they will often adopt, and this is a good thing, don't get me wrong, they will adopt concepts from other adjacent fields to kind of bolster their own framework, if you will, and make them have a little bit more of a foundation to stand upon. A great example of this is the general adaptation syndrome from Hans Sale, right? It's almost a good fit for training, and this was originally observed in like, okay, I'm going to take an animal and then just expose them to like a noxious something that will kill them. And initially we're seeing, oh, it's disturbing homeostasis. Their physiology responds. They're trying to maintain homeostasis. But if I don't take them out of this, toxic substance, they die. Not exactly the same as going, well, I'm going to do 8x5 instead of 3x5, right? Um, Now, some people have critiqued this and gone, gas is a wholly non-applicable concept and it shouldn't be applied. I don't think that's true. I think probably a better critique of this is that while the initial gas model was adapted into exercise science and we kind of ran with it, we didn't necessarily pay attention to how that fundamental principle of physiology and biology evolved with those fields. So there was a lag before people started going, hey, what about the biopsychosocial model? You know, and also, is this something that can actually predict outcomes if we're going to say that everything's based upon this? So going back to the concept of periodization, which is largely based upon these inductive observations, that was developed before, I would say, an I'd say a methodological model of science communication developed called evidence-based medicine, right? So you see this in this parallel field, starting in the 80s, there became a call for saying, hey, physicians, they get their degree, they do their residency, they become medical doctors, and then 20 years pass, and there's nothing to really ensure that they're not using a 20-year-old surgical technique in their practice, or they're not just kind of doing what was normal practice or what seemed to work. And this is causing, verifiable issues in society. So starting in the 90s, we saw this really clear call for what's called evidence-based medicine. And this is something, evidence-based practice, we have, the individual preferences of the patient, we have the experiences of the practitioner, and then we have the research that's actually being published that you need to stay up to date with as the kind of the three-legged stool that supports an evidence-based practitioner model, right? So there was a paper, I think in 2012, in the Strength and Conditioning Journal, where someone said, "Hey, we should do this for training." And now, almost 15 years after that, this is something we talk about and we define. And we had debates about this even 5, 10 years ago. There's a difference between just reading science and just having a PubMed, ID, and actually being an evidence-based practitioner and incorporating those three things and understanding them and how they can and sometimes do, fulfill different roles and are complementary. The point being, though, is that the whole idea of being an evidence-based practitioner or an evidence-based approach, that is someone going, hey, I'm going to propose this model of knowing, right? So it directly ties into how do we know what we know? And it is, approved, verified, thought about, and was written about for 20 years and is still being written about in medicine, which is kind of, up that chain a little closer to biology. So we've adopted that, but we haven't fully adopted it and thought about it completely. So you get someone who is a content creator who is unaware of that, hasn't read those papers, and maybe just doesn't buy it, and they're going to be talking about the same studies or highlighting certain studies and not others, and you're just going like, well, why are they ignoring this meta-regression or this meta-analysis, the systematic review, or these 5 randomized controlled trials for this one more mechanistic study that they seem to like and agree with? And the first thought, if you assume everyone sees the world the same way you do, is that they are either stupid or that they are willfully ignorant, or they're providing disinformation to promote their own agenda. But it might come down to a fundamental difference in the way they were trained and maybe even their beliefs about the world and knowledge. So to tie this into what I was saying before, periodization developed before we had, evidence-based practice. So we get 20 years of research before we've actually fundamentally agreed as a field, you know what? Randomized controlled trials and the meta-analyses of those randomized controlled trials and systematic reviews of them, those should be seen as higher quality evidence than, say, observational data. So by the time that happens, and we're all, good with that, right around the time I'm being born and then becoming a teenager, and then by the time I get into science, this is a thing that we probably all agree on in exercise science, maybe haven't talked about enough publicly. You've got multiple decades of people just citing each other, So like if you read a periodization paper now, sometimes you'll be like, okay, they cited, this person, and you realize that that was a citation of a narrative review. And then you go to the narrative review, and what did they cite? Oh, they cited a textbook, right? And you go back and then you realize the textbook, the things they cited were observational studies. And you're like, oh shit, like much of what we're saying is not actually based upon something that is appropriate. It's not the best available evidence to support or disprove that claim. And that's an example of what happens when a field advances without kind of incorporating this more intentional thought about how do we know what we know. Because the decision to use an inductive or deductive process, that's just where it starts. And then we go, okay, well, we've got this hierarchy of evidence where induction is lower, observational data and seeing things. And then we have different levels of quality deductive observations, and I think a really interesting way to show how this can be fundamentally different if you come from a different background. And I say this because my wife is doing her PhD in geology. We have an underlying approach to doing sports science that is based upon a probabilistic understanding using statistics of what we see, because there's inherent variation that we can't get away from. I'm doing a sample of a group from a population because I want to know what the typical response is, but I know that there's going to be much more than the thing that I'm intervening with and modifying that's going to modify that outcome. Imagine you're a geologist. You're going into a place that's been around for 4 billion years and has changed dramatically. And you're trying to basically forensically work backwards to figure out, why is what I'm seeing today here? There is no variability. There is no intervention. There is only, okay, how do I determine the minerals that are present in this rock? How do I determine the changes in the environment here, this geothermal system, right? And then the reason I'm bringing all this up is just to point out that they don't get trained in stats at all, right? They don't get trained in deductive reasoning at all. It's a fundamentally inductive field, and so things can persist for a long time without getting disproven. Like if you ever want to read an interesting, paper about geology, it's like, how long did it take them to accept the idea of tectonic plates, and what actually got that to move forward is quite fascinating. And let's say someone is trained in geology, but then becomes really, really interested in exercise science. Um, their training will tell them, I want to create a model based upon what I see and what makes sense, and it needs to be logical and it needs to be consistent at every point in the chain. That's a really good way of seeing the world and recreating things. But you may not necessarily have the same value that you put on randomized controlled trials and meta-analyses and statistics, because you fundamentally don't understand them in one level, and you also don't get that you can actually test models. So we have models in all fields, but in models where we study humans, like biology and all the things that come out of it, you can typically, well, you should, this is actually a newer thing that we're doing now, or that James Steele would call for, we create a theory of understanding. Like we take a look at what's going on and we go, all right, I think this is what's happening. Now I'm going to go out and do experiments to see if I can disprove it, right? Because it's almost impossible to truly prove something. And this kind of goes all the way back to Karl Popper, which I can let you talk about if you want. But the idea being, it's different than looking at a forensic analysis of how did this hydrothermal field come to be today and what can we learn from it. You're saying, okay, cool. I think hypertrophy operates in this way. These are the mechanosensors. This is what stimulates them. Therefore, this should be the best way to go. The next and final and most important step is to go, okay, cool. Now I'm going to create two groups or two conditions or any kind of experiment that we want to use where I can experimentally test that. Okay, the eccentric does nothing except cause fatigue and damage and is not stimulative for growth at all because of my understanding of these, because of my theory of these mechanosensors. No problem. Now I'm going to do a concentric only training group, an eccentric only training group, a control group, and maybe an eccentric concentric group, and then I'm going to watch them do their thing. All right, crap. We have a lot of variability. I need to do this 10 times because I can't get large sample sizes. Cool. In 10 years, maybe we'll have a meta-analysis on this. And that is what we use to check the model, right? And that's that important piece that someone, if they were not necessarily trained in this hierarchy of evidence and the underlying reasoning behind it, and they don't ascribe to that belief, they may never feel the need to look at that experimental evidence. Or they might feel that, no, we have this mechanistic understanding that makes sense, so something wrong with the randomized controlled trials or the meta-analysis because stats are messy and human research is messy. And unless they value that, and unless they see the purpose of it, and unless they can understand the degree to which that variability and that uncertainty can actually impact the outcomes, they won't be able to assess when it is a sufficient disproof of the model or the theory they had beforehand. And I've come to realize that some of the people who promote information looking at similar research that I do, but have very different conclusions, whether they realize it or not, again, whether implicit or explicit, I don't think they have the same fundamental philosophical standing of how do we acquire and test knowledge. So that's an example of how it plays out in the world. And so that is why it's so important to understand something like the difference between induction and deduction. Because as a consumer of information, if you're listening to me or you or someone else talk, you kind of are buying into the worldview of the person because they're not making like a positionality statement on Instagram, right? They're not saying, "Hey, I'm I'm a constructionist or I'm a critical realist, right? And here's how I see the world." They're just going, "Hey, this study showed this. Therefore, we understand that Titan is the primary thing that senses tension. Titan does this during the eccentric, it does this during the concentric. Therefore, the concentric is what grows muscle, the eccentric does nothing. Boom. Here's an infographic." Um, but someone like me might say, "Hey, we're still understanding how muscle physiology works. Titan does this, this does this, and there's potential sensing mechanisms we don't even have yet. And it seems like there are different ways of creating mechanical tension. And despite the fact that the concentric and eccentric do fundamentally different things, when we actually do training that excludes the eccentric, we see way less hypertrophy. And it's been shown in double-digit numbers of umbrella reviews, systematic reviews, and meta-analyses. So clearly, eccentric is actually a critical, if not even more important, aspect of dynamic isoinertial resistance training that produces hypertrophy. Those are polar opposite, conclusions from people who are reading research. And how did that happen? Well, it's because of everything I just talked about.
You just read my mind. I wanted to dig a little bit deeper into actually positivism, constructivism, and critical realism. I thought of the biopsychosocial model of pain as an example. Please correct
Mm-hmm.
me if it fits or if it doesn't, because these things, like you mentioned already, perhaps we're not even aware of it. My view of science when I was, well, a little younger and wanted to go into philosophy is that science was strictly positivism. It's either this or it's that, or
Yeah.
it's called I don't recall the term for it, but it's just that one way of knowledge, it's the correct way of knowledge, you
Yeah.
know. And then we have
Objectivism.
objectivism. Yeah, yeah, that was
Yeah.
one. For instance, if we have pain, it's because there's tissue damage that explains the pain. Positivism. Then we have biopsychosocial that, okay, maybe it's the way we interpret pain, the emotions that come attached to pain, the relationships that we build with our trainers, with a physician or whoever is talking to us about pain. And then one, it's just an observation of mine, but maybe you can talk a little bit about this in the science field, that science itself as an industry tends to be a little bit pragmatic. We need to
Mm.
produce data, we need to produce studies, we need to publish, publish, publish because it's an industry, right? And then when we in the other side of the coin, when we try to explain our point of view or correct something or correct someone in social media because they're wrong and we are smarter than them, we put link to PubMed, you know, and it's pure positivism. And I think by not knowing the way we are trained, the way that we are getting and acquiring knowledge and putting that knowledge into practice, we can have those, like you mentioned, those points of view on the same topic, on the same paper that are contrary. And one other example that I thought of this phenomena, it's one that steers the pot a lot in the fitness industry, which is volume. Training volume when it's high, when it's low, when you get these discussions, and people get a little bit emotional, I think, by knowing or not knowing. But I think it's so fascinating, not just because of the sports science that comes with it, but but the capacity of some people like yourself to remain, how can I put it, poised, to remain a little bit neutral, not because we are being passive but because we know our current limitations or our own particular biases, and it's an intellectual challenge that I think philosophy of science can help us with. At least that's the way I'm trying to understand it after frying my brain for hours, man. But please tell me if I got it all wrong or mixed up.
No, I think you're all over it. I think, yeah, so yeah, like Steele does a good job of, if anyone wants to read about this and dig in, but doesn't want to go all the way down the rabbit hole like you did and actually read the like the fundamental underlying research, he has a really good preprint of a book chapter that he wrote that is specific to sports science and exercise science. And if you just Google James Steele sports science, philosophy of science, you can find the preprint foundations of scientific research in sport and exercise science. His textbook chapter that is specifically on um, the foundations of like philosophy of science as it applies to exercise science. So what we're talking about when you discuss positivism or critical realism, for example, are essentially an epistemological lens that you use to identify the world and your position in it and what can be known. So epistemology is essential. Well, so ontology is like what is there to know, and epistemology is how can we know it. And I will not pretend to be able to state, and I don't think anyone can, that there's a way of showing what's the right worldview, because it is fundamental to the worldview that maybe you can't know these things. So essentially, there's kind of two portions to positivism, constructivism, and critical realism. And it's what is your belief about the world? And then what is your belief about how you can access information from the world? So, like you said, a positivist says, listen, there is a physical world that is predictable, um, that, there are molecules, atoms, particles, you go all the way down to the smallest element of physics. If you could create a God calculator that would require more energy than there is in the universe to actually measure the movement of all things, you could perfectly predict or simulate everything that is ever going to happen. And now there's even questions about, free will in this and all that stuff that we won't even get to. Um, and that we can objectively measure these things and know them theoretically, right? To the degree that our methods allow us. Um, and that is like diametrically opposed to constructivism, which says, listen, there may or may not be a real objective world out there, but it sort of doesn't matter because I can only see it through my own lens. I have a subjective experience. I can't be outside of my own brain. And as a human, my brain is influencing my perceptions. You know, you can give me LSD. Is that pink elephant actually there? So how can I trust anything? It's just one really basic drug-induced example of this. Um, and then where I think probably most people sit, even in the more hardcore sciences, is what we would describe as critical realism. There is an objective world out there. It is measurable, but I can only access it through my subjective experience. So that creates some important limitations. And even if someone feels that they have this they're super objective, everything is this very like measurable way that the world operates. If they state the limitations in their research, and they acknowledge the fact that the simple act of researching influences the outcomes, they're kind of buying into a little bit of critical realism in a very pragmatic or practical way. So, like a great example is if you want to study muscle damage and you have to and you want to actually look at, let's say, like Z-line streaming, the actual change under a microscope to the muscle tissue from doing exercise, you're going to do a biopsy. You might do repeated biopsies. And then maybe you want to look over multiple days at not only that Z-line streaming, but also some of the inflammatory responses and markers. You have to acknowledge that by taking a chunk of muscle out of someone's quad, you're inducing muscle damage beyond the drop jumps they did before that. So that's that's an example everyone would buy into, that the research itself is influencing what I'm observing, right? But I think if you take a step back and you were to then talk to, say, a sports psychologist who is probably much more comfortable with the concept of critical realism, you would say, okay, I don't buy this. I'm a sports scientist. Um, Forget the muscle damage example. We'll just use, I'm telling people to sprint and we got timing gates. Okay. All right. I got a radar gun. I know the measurement error. With a certain degree of confidence, the right statistical model, I can tell you if I have enough people that group ran faster than that group, or in that condition, they ran faster than that condition. And I did a randomized crossover. So I know that's not the order effect. Okay. It's the same people. And, during one crossover arm, I had them do strength training. During the other one, I had them do yoga. Strength training made them run faster. What is there to be, like, what are we confused about here? The critical realist would say, well, like, what was your relationship with the participants in, in that testing environment? And were you the same when you tested them in both cases? Were you grumpy one day and you didn't seem to be caring, and maybe you gave verbal motivation, but it was like, yeah, let's go, because you were at the end of your data collection in one condition versus the other. And do you think that has an influence on the participant? And you go, well, okay. So yeah, people who volunteer for studies, they are probably influenced by the relationship, and they maybe want to be a people pleaser. And we do know that verbal motivation has an effect. And okay, the biopsychosocial model. Now, the thing is that doesn't mean that positivism is wrong or objectivism is wrong. You would then just view it differently. Like the positivist or the objectivist could then dig in their heels and go, right, okay, well, verbal motivation, it's going to have some impact on, say, the neuroendocrine response. And if I could measure the actual, hormonal response and I don't know if I can uh, the adrenaline response to that motivation, and if I could get a validated scale to assess how much they relied on interpersonal validation to be motivated, and then how that affected corticospinal, voluntary activation of their muscles involved in running, then I could actually quantify that, right? So you can really dig your heels in and maintain one of these positions, but at every step of the way of your methods and your explanation, as say, a positivist, a constructivist, or a critical realist could say, well, what about the influence of that we can't measure? What about the influence of that we can't measure? So to come back to what you were saying about being a pragmatist or a practicalist, it's basically just saying, should we worry about some of these things that we can't modify? And should we just go with whatever epistemological commitment is appropriate based upon the study design and the data we have in front of us? And that's kind of where I often sit. I'm probably a critical realist if I thought about it. You know, there is an objective world. I I have never seen something that I might not be able to explain it, but that I think could not be explained. Um, and if I ever did see something that I think could not be explained, my first thought would be, did someone slip LSD into my drink? Not, oh, therefore there must be a God. But that's just me. So I can't I can't prove that that's the right way of being. So that's why you get these fundamental debates, and that's why you get people who are never going to see eye to eye. And then we take this all the way back to say, the volume debate. These ways of being in the world, seeing the world, and trying to understand the world are going to influence people in different ways. They might value their experiences to a greater degree than even scientific data for some of these reasons. I don't agree with that. I don't think it's the best way to go. So if they have this fundamental belief that high volume training is maybe injurious, causes a lot of swelling, a lot of things that could be mistaken for hypertrophy, and that low volume training at higher intensities, it allows you to really access the most important aspects of stimulating growth, then someone saying something like, oh, higher volumes just have this increasing swelling response, and the ultrasound muscle thickness can't discern that. It's not high volume causing more hypertrophy. High volume causes uh, swelling. And if you look at the volume data on strength, it plateaus a lot earlier, right around, what I think is an appropriate moderate low volume. And, hypertrophy should be causing strength. And if it doesn't, and it's just swelling, that can be quite convincing. And, I can sit there and go, well, we look at these, 6 day later versus 2 day later ultrasound scans of people doing high volume training, and there's almost perfect agreement. So that means it's probably not swelling. Or hold on, that means we need to have a dose response of swelling with volume that doesn't taper off. And what about the repeated bout effect? And what about the data showing that being closer to failure more reliably increases, muscle damage and swelling than actual volume itself? So I can say those things, but if someone is on a very different wavelength than I am, for lack of a better term, in terms of their like epistemology, that may be falling on deaf ears, because my arguments are based upon assuming that they value the same pieces of knowledge to the same degree, and that the evidence and proof that I value and I have committed to and I see as convincing are convincing for them. And if that was the case, well, I wouldn't even need to have a job. I wouldn't need to explain things in a different way. I would just need to give people a list of references to read. And, if people had unlimited motivation, that's another topic. They would read it and come to the exact same conclusions as me. But the reality is that you can give the same evidence to two people of a similar degree of intelligence, but if they have different values or ways of seeing the world that result in a different epistemological commitment, basically a fundamentally different, either purposeful or just implicit. They don't even really realize they see the world that way. Different, essentially philosophical traditions of how do I know what's in the world and how do I access that information, they're not going to interpret it the same way. And I can't confidently say, and they're wrong and I'm right, which is, I think, the challenging thing. Um, so a lot of the times what I do as a science communicator is I try to embed a little bit of this so that we understand, like, all right, what are we coming to the table with? Because it's a waste of my time, frankly, to try to communicate to people who actually don't think that science has value, even if they fully understand it. I would say most people, like if you look at some of the debates that we had with, say, like, Alexander Bromley or Chasm, he hosted a few podcasts. I would say a lot of those debates weren't about fundamental differences. They were misunderstanding the limitations of science and what it could tell them. Um, so, like the idea that if we could just simply have a massive app that tracked training data that we could pick out all the best training protocols, it kind of has some assumptions built into it that everyone responds the same way if we could just figure it out. Or on the flip side of it, if we just could track all this data, that we could get you the perfect individualized program, which probably isn't true either because you change over time and we are just not at that point, even with modern technology. So, what science does was being misunderstood in those conversations. So, if you don't understand how science operates, then you aren't going to understand its limitations and you're going to think it's either more or less limited than it is. And there's a ton of people who, because they think science is more or less limited than it is, make different conclusions. You have your PubMed warriors who just drop a PMID, like you said, the positivists who think there is a study. Studies are perfect as long as they're not done wrong, and I think this one wasn't done wrong. So that this is what it is. They observed this. That's it. That's it. And then you have the people who are don't understand the limitations of science. They think some of these things they've broken it, right? They don't understand that with enough statistical power and enough things, we can actually fix that issue. And they go, yeah, well, what about this? What about the dietary issues in this study? I had one where it was I did a within subject design muscle damage study that was part of Dr. Refalo's thesis. Great work, right? And someone came into the comments and they were like, "Well, how do you know that everyone was on the same size surplus?" And I said they weren't. And he goes, "Okay, then how can we trust the results of the study?" And I said, "Well, it's a within subject design, so it means the right leg and the left leg were both assigned to the same diet because they're both connected to the same GI tract." And they go, "Yeah, but what if one person was on a calorie deficit and someone else in a surplus? How do we know that failure is operating the same?" And I said, "Well, because they were randomly distributed between the two conditions. So we've controlled for that with a sufficient sample size." And that's just not something they understood. And I would have had to have taught them, sample size calculation and the methods of using within subject design and the influence of diet and then how that's controlled for and then how we need to see it over time and then the measurement error of ultrasound. So that is maybe the 6 hours of me sitting down and talking to them in person to fully understand that, and maybe like an hour and a half if they were not obstinate and were actually buying in and could understand it. I can't do that on Instagram, right? So I have to kind of layer this in and embed it and talk about it a little bit here and there just to make sure that the audience who's at least stuck with me through this podcast or this post or this Instagram live is operating on the same basic understanding or agreement of how do we know things before then I go, and here's what we found. And you just can't always do that, nor should you always do that when you're trying to communicate science. You have to kind of assume, all right, my core audience, if they're science interested and they're coming here to figure out how do I manipulate, training or nutrition to get an outcome, they're probably on the same page with me for the most part. So I'm going to go, okay, cool. This meta-analysis, which is a study of studies where they take similar things and they look at the same thing, they concluded this, and it was 24 studies across 800 people. Oh, that's pretty convincing, and I let them know I think this is really good. Here are the limitations. Boom, I can do that in under 3 minutes, and so long as most people are at least close to my kind of view of the world and my you know philosophical tradition, if you will, then the majority of them are going to find that useful and helpful. And the people who aren't probably wouldn't have clicked on it in the first place. And there's going to be a few folks who are, you know, just not on the same page who leave those obstinate comments. And they might just be Russian bots. At least that's what I tell myself.
Or Mexican bots commanded by me. What, just to finish off, man, you mentioned a lot of super interesting points that I would love to dig in more into it. But one of the things that I personally look up to you, for the most part, is that you as a scientist and also as a science communicator, you don't play science gatekeeper. You don't play. There's another term which is scholastic epistemicentrism, something along those lines. I read it in
It's a new
Spanish, so
term for me.
it's
I'll
kind of
trust you.
it's kind of hard to translate it into English. It's basically playing gatekeeper with science being the only way of knowledge, and science being just an idea, a concept, not a methodology. And that tends to happen, at least in my side of things,
Mm.
with social media, with perhaps influencers and people that claim to be evidence-based, but they're just more gatekeepers of said knowledge, which you don't play that game. And I think it's, for you at least, should be really hard because you have a really big audience in Instagram at least. And also, you published a lot of papers, so that's one of the things that I wanted to ask you. How do you do it, man? How do you manage to not jump into this game of being the authority, being science, the big science?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough one because it's pretty clear when you read psychology research and you read sociology research that if someone speaks with authority and speaks with definitive nature, they will be viewed as a higher quality argument, regardless of the actual quality of their, say, their logic, for example. Um, it's also been shown that if you present the same information as a critique of someone else, you're generally rated by an audience as smarter than if you were to just present the information without critiquing someone else. So there is some low-hanging fruit that many, 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 many people use of just being incredibly certain and dunking on other people. Reaction videos, that's the way it goes right now. So it's a tough thing. I try to present myself honestly, and unfortunately, I do think I'm an expert. I would hope so after this long of study and also this long of training people and, training myself to where what I say has some merit, but I never expect the person to just take my word for it. And I need to give them the evidence, probably pathologically to the point where it makes me take longer to explain things and I could have a million followers instead of 200,000, right? Um, but I also understand that probably the niche I fill is that I'm educating a lot of other people who are also educators. I think some people they're looking to be, like B2B or B2C, like a direct business to customer B2C or business to business. I think I have plenty of B2C. Don't get me wrong. There's a ton of bodybuilders and powerlifters like Eric. What do you think on this? For sure. But I think probably more than other content creators, and certainly more than other content creators with a larger following, I think I do a little more B2B than most. There's a lot of people who subscribe to Mass, read my books, or do podcasts with me because they're trying to educate trainers, or or they are a trainer and they have a large audience, and they want to make sure they get it right talking to me or furthering their own understanding so that they can communicate onwards. So I kind of like to think I have kind of this like spider web effect,
Mhm.
or at least that's how I go to sleep at night. Um, and and I so for me, I would be subverting that audience if I basically started turning off their critical thinking and just saying, "Hey, listen to me because I'm a fucking man." That's um, potentially helpful if I'm trying to get elected or just grow my following. And you could even make an argument, Eric, if you did just a little more of that, you can have twice as many followers, reach a larger audience, and then, still pepper in that good stuff. Maybe they're right. Um, it's also one that I've thought about. It's like, I have been doing this for a while. Like having a relatively large following on Instagram is one thing, but there's people who've grown an Instagram following up to 200K in 2 years, not 9, like I have. So am I growing despite the fact that I'm holding myself back with the way I operate? Is that a worthwhile uh, trade-off? And then am I too far forward in the conservative approach I take or that type of approach? So those are things I think about, Daniel. But I think another thing to consider is that I have been gate kept myself, so I know what it's like to have my opinion dismissed because of how I'm seen. And I've also seen the harm of gatekeeping, even when the person is right, who is doing the gatekeeping, into how their information is taken up. A great example of this is kind of the science bro science wars that occurred 10 years ago related to if it fits your macros. Um, you had these very strong traditional practices which were sufficient to result in success in the bodybuilding community of following a relatively short, in modern terms, say 12 to 16 week diet, where you would just have 3 different phases ish, and I'm generalizing, where you would cut out foods. And many people saw this as those foods are inherently fattening or they don't make you look as lean or whatever. And by the end, you need to be on protein and veggies. not because of metabolic adaptation, losing weight, and needing to have a lower calorie intake and that effectively working, but because there's something special about these foods and these phases. And don't try to tell me different, because that's how Olympians have been doing it, and Mr. Americas and Mr. Universes for decades. That's how the top guys are doing it. That's how they say it works. And how dare you, pencil neck geek who's never even competed, try to tell me it's something different. Also, in this condescending way, and dismiss what I'm saying, despite the fact that I have been incredibly successful and I'm surrounded by people who've been incredibly successful with this approach. So the dismissive gatekeeping attitude of people who are actually correct and could be helping those folks was counterproductive. It created divisions, camps, ideologies, like you said, and essentially just, no, I'm not going to listen to that person. It became a microcosm of like American politics, where people don't even listen to each other. And I wanted to avoid that. I wanted to get away from that. And I had ironically been on both sides of that. So there's a really interesting phenomenon called the Sagan effect, which is something that plagues science communicators who are also actual scientists. So Carl Sagan was kind of America's first physics and cosmology science communicator. Awesome if you ever want to read Carl Sagan's books. Neil deGrasse Tyson was actually his doctoral student. So he's kind of carrying on that tradition of not just being an astrophysicist, which requires a level of brilliance that the typical person doesn't have, but also seeing the importance of not just doing the astrophysics work, the actual theoretical or experimental physics work that helps us understand the world we live in, but fostering that love for understanding the world around us in the public, so that we do continue to pursue science, that things like NASA evolve and universities get funding, and so that we can learn more about the world and we don't slip into a modern dark age, right? That's important stuff. So not all scientists are taught that that's important. Not all of them are good at it. And in fact, many of them see people who pursue science communication in parallel to a scientific career as attention seeking, as self promotion, as arrogance, and potentially as having ulterior motives of trying to make money or just be famous. And I'm not saying that there aren't examples of people doing exactly that. I question the motives of a Huberman, for example. So it's a real thing. But in some cases where the academic is doing good academic work and also trying to science communicate for the right reasons, or at least mostly the right reasons, I'm not going to say I have no ego, that actually hurts them. So Carl Sagan was denied entrance into a prestigious Academy of Science as well as tenure, despite having equal to or more publications than the typical member of the Academy of Science or tenure holders in his institution. And there's been several studies that have done interviews, surveys, or looked at attitudes of scientists, where generally the more science communication work a scientist does, it devalues in the eyes of other scientists the actual quality of their scientific work. And it's because it's seen as, well, why aren't you doing this like the real science, and why are you making this all about you? It should be about the work. And I think that is an unfortunate thing. And the data would actually show that scientists who are involved in more media appearances and doing more actual science communication in the public, they generally have higher publications. And I don't think this is like a cause and effect thing. Like, this sounds like I'm shitting on people who aren't science communicators. What I'm saying is that if your work gets cited more out in the public, you're going to get asked by more people to do media appearances, right? And then I think so. This is kind of like they're one and the same. So we have this parallel problem of, there are science communicators who are quite literally just trying to sell books, become famous, and stroke their egos and make money. And that's a problem, because they don't always appropriately communicate science. And then you have a lot of scientists who are doing a very good job in parallel to their scientific career communicating science, which is, in an applied field like exercise science, it's the job, right? In my opinion. You can be very, very mechanistic and lab-based, and you can kind of hand that off. But if you're in strength conditioning or sports nutrition, ultimately, this is a direct-to-consumer kind of science, right? We're specifically trying to help athletes, lifters, coaches. We're dealing with other people. It's not experimental physics where the common man is like a NASA engineer, right? Who we're trying to communicate to. So the gatekeeping occurs on both sides of it. I recently published with Dr. Trexler and Dr. Ruffalo a meta regression on protein intake in a dieting state. And one of the comments that really got to me was, oh, so these three powerlifting coaches think they know how to publish science. And I'm like, hold on. Like, either I am too nerdy for the bros, right? Like, oh, who is this pencil neck nerd? You're not an IFBB pro. Or who is this bro who just coaches powerlifters? What does he think he's doing in academia? So it's kind of a frustrating thing. I have been gate kept by my brothers and sisters in iron, and I have been gate kept by my brothers and sisters in science. And it's a frustrating thing, but because I've been victim to it, I've been oppressed, Daniel. Um, I try not to do it to other people because I see how counterproductive it is. It is an intellectual shortcut when you disagree with something or it doesn't fit your biases to not have to think about what they're saying or to devalue what they're doing or to protect your own ego in most cases. It's not always wrong because there are pure bros, like I said, the IFBB pro who is telling you you only have to eat fish in the last 6 weeks, and they are wrong, right? And it is potentially harmful. Will it work? Maybe, potentially. It has for them, but there are probably better ways to do it. But shitting on them in an online debate is not going to change hearts and minds. At best, it might convince some other people who think like you who are observing in the comments. But if you can find a way to figure out what their view of the world is, essentially going back to the topic of philosophy of science and where they're coming from, and you meet them halfway, you may not convince them, but you're going to convince a whole lot of onlookers who are maybe closer to them than you because you've given a little bit of acknowledgement of their worldview. You've juxtapositioned that with your worldview and maybe the closest thing we have to objective data. And you've probably helped more people who are watching that in that instance. And you've also avoided creating ideologies. And you just made it harder for the natural tendency of people to use their biases to block off entire sources of information. So I am loath to do things that I think close doors. And for the community I'm trying to serve, which is essentially all lifters, I am trying to draw as many, circles, not borders around us. And I think a big part of that is kind of acknowledging that gatekeeping it's not productive, um, even when it's right. And just because someone else is wrong doesn't mean that they're intentionally wrong. They know they're wrong, nor that they will respond well to just being told, "Hey, guess what? You're wrong."
Oh man, I would love to go on for hours because you touch on many topics that I currently see in my own circle in Latin America, in Mexico. I see a lot of this gatekeeping, whether it's intentional or not. I see a lot of people that react to videos, and always the one reacting is the one that tends to be correct. Yeah. Go figure. And the way that you put out your work as a scientist, but also as a science communicator, it actually reminds me a lot of Sagan and also Richard Feynman. You, these people don't come to say, this is it, positivism. They more so spark curiosity, but also give you a sense of direction that I do not have all the answers, but I can lead you the way to learn about these things, the limitations of science, what's actually being done in research, and based upon that, you can begin to learn to actually apply this science into your practice and with a particular caveat that I think is really valuable and important, embracing uncertainty, which
Yeah.
is something that a lot of people do not do because, well, social media doesn't want uncertainty in a 15-second, 20-second reel. You need to be to the point and you need to be either this or that. And I think that limits our understanding or views of the world in a really paradoxical manner, Eric, because we have all this access to, man, shit ton of information, but our world keeps getting more closed up because of this gatekeeping, which it blows my mind, and that's why I specifically chose this topic and to get the opportunity to talk to you. So, man, just to close up, and I don't want to take any more of your time. Do you have any? Because you're already mentioned a lot of important things. A piece of advice for people to make sense of the current world we live in, whether it's they're interested in sports science, in being coaches, using social media to talk about science. Would you have, with all your years of experience and also this way of thinking, a piece of advice for all of us?
Yes, I do. And first, thank you for the opportunity and the kind words, and I really enjoyed this conversation. Um, I think the most important thing that you can take away from this specific conversation is that while it may not be your interest, or while like you probably got online and you're just like, fuck, I just want to know how to get bigger and the most efficient way to do it, or lose some fat, or get stronger, or what have you. There is so much information now that you essentially must spend a little bit of time assessing the way that the people who are communicating information to you see the world. You want to try to gauge whether your view of knowledge, essentially your epistemology, what do you believe to be true, is at least somewhat in line with the person you're listening to. Because you can get convinced of things by what you might describe as cherry picking or selective interpretation of research. Even if you, like, let's say you're just like me, you're a pretty objective person, you believe in a physical world, and you understand the limitations of our own subjective experience. So you're, maybe a critical realist and who values research. Um, you want to make sure that the person you're listening to is kind of on the same page. And this is where you can often see, like, medical doctors or people who aren't specifically trained in nutrition, like a chiropractor, or even someone like a neuroscientist, like an example of Huberman. They can get things wrong, not out of malice, not even out of the desire to make money or anything like that, but because they're just unaware of a given field. So, there are a ton of people who are intellectuals who are then going, all right, because I studied engineering or because I studied insert your own thing and I like to lift weights, I'm going to go look for the science-based folks in the lifting world. And nowadays, because there's so much information and so many people, you might find someone who appears to be science-based. And because you don't know every single reference, and if you did, you don't necessarily understand the methods that are specific to the field of sports science and sports nutrition, and you can go, frick, they've led me down this incorrect pathway. A great example of this is Gary Taubes. He is someone who is a journalist and had a certain feeling and saw a certain conspiratorial thing and had a bias towards low carb, and he could selectively take scientific references and lead you to the conclusion that low carb is better for health as well as metabolic disease and even potentially body composition. And when you read those references, they fit together in a logical sequence, and his narration as a journalist is very convincing. And I would not be surprised by anybody who is, let's say, even a bachelor's in exercise science, not nutrition, who came across that in, say, 2012 and came to that conclusion. That's the deal. Greg Nuckols, actually, one of the smarter thinkers in the space of evidence-based sports science, he first came across that as, I think, an undergrad student, and he was convinced that low carb diets were better than other diets and independent of protein intake or calorie control. And I think that's really, really common, and it's happening more and more areas now. So what you need to do, because you don't know every single study that's been published, that's why you're coming to find someone who seems like they do, is assess, does this person have a commitment to, say, evidence-based practice, to, say, a similar epistemological lens that I do? Do they believe that a model is great, but that it needs to be checked with experimental evidence? Because they will probably expose themselves. You might find someone who goes, no, mechanisms over research every time. And if you see that, you go, oh, hold on, like I actually don't think that makes sense from our best understanding of how to interpret research on humans. So maybe even though you're citing research and it makes sense and I can see this infographic, maybe I need to be a little more skeptical of the way that you interpret this and look to someone else. So I think not just about the information that you're being given by someone you follow, but also how they come to form the conclusions in the first place. They won't always they're not always going to explicitly share this with you or even be consistent if they have certain human biases. But everyone does have a positionality, whether they realize it or not, and it's going to really shape their interpretation of the world. And if you don't fundamentally agree with it enough to take value from them, that can be a problem, and it can lead you down a wrong path where you can be very confused. So I think you need to think not about just the information you're exposed to, especially when you're seeing two people who have more expertise than you. It's very difficult to discern who's right. Is to think about, are there differences in their way of interpreting information and communicating it and seeing the world, and which of them makes more sense to me from a bigger picture perspective. And that's where I think someone like yourself with a background of philosophy is probably able to be convinced by incorrect arguments more often because you actually might think about those things or see those things. And that's something we can all do. And it doesn't take much. Even a small amount of exposure to the philosophy of science can have a really important impact on how often you are hoodwinked. There was actually a really cool study, and we'll leave it here after this, where they compared taking your typical research methods class, which teaches you about stats, teaches you about observational research, that, and then the students, how many of them held contradictory conspiratorial beliefs compared to a philosophy of science class. So that means learning about how science is done, like in an exercise science lab, it didn't change it at all. They had the same number of beliefs that were literally in contrary to one another. Like you can't technically hold them both to be true. But when you polled the students after they had the philosophy of science class, they reduced the number of contradictory conspiratorial beliefs they had because they actually were now exposed to the idea of logic, right? So, the example I love to use because I think it's right with the current political strife that we deal with is say if you're a little more right wing, which is nothing inherently wrong with, you might believe that big government is bureaucratic, clunky, slow, inefficient, and it creates these barriers to a more prosperous society if there was maybe a more of a free market or a less bureaucratic, top-down, centrally governing model. Okay? Right next to you, there might be someone else who thinks that there is a deep state and a global conspiracy, globalists. They hold the same beliefs about what's the best way to govern the world, but they think there's this massive conspiracy to where we're actually being controlled by central government and big government. And they'll agree with each other. But you don't get to choose both. That's actually illogical. You can't have a clunky bureaucracy that's inefficient that is also able to maintain a global conspiracy that can control the world and has done so for decades, right? It's one or the other, not both. So that's just one example where if you don't actually think through the way that we know things and can know things, or logic, this must be true, therefore this if then statements and where those break down and when they hold up, then you can hold those two beliefs because they fit your biases and you don't question them. But if you are taught to think logically and question your biases, then eventually you have to go, oh shit, I guess those both can't be true. I need to keep one. And that can pervade through your entire view of the world, which is only going to help you. So hopefully that little minor diatribe at the end helps people understand the importance of this.
Oh, for real, man. And you actually read my mind 3 times if we count the Mexican bots time. One of the questions that I had for you is how can smart people believe in conspiracies? And man, you talk about Greg being one of the smartest people that I can think of, actually thinking about low carb and Gary Tubes. And man, we didn't even touch on the recent Kevin Hall controversy, which maybe we can talk someplace else. Um, but what you actually reminded me too of a movie called The Limits of Control, which actually touches on that very same topic of what are the limits of how can much can it be controlled, which is frankly ridiculous. But yeah,
Mm-hmm.
really smart people can believe really questionable things. And I think that's the challenge for all of us, whether it's students, whether it's coaches, athletes even, because we all want to get better one way or another. So I think that's why philosophy of science, it's really an important conversation to be had. And also, sadly enough, it's one of the lesser it's not so fun for most people. It's confusing. It's like, why are they not talking about volume or protein or
Yeah.
whatever? Which which don't get me wrong, I love those conversations, but this one in particularly, man, I can thank you enough for the extra time. Even it's frankly one of my favorites that I have the pleasure of having with you, the conversations, because it it brings me to a level of understanding of my own biases that if it wasn't for this opportunity to have these conversations, I would never have one. So thanks a lot for that, and I hope we can do this again some other time, and we get to perhaps I'm talking in the really far future, but step on stage together, perhaps, man. It's just my
I would love that. That would be an honor. And this has been a true pleasure. I love the conversations like this. It pushes me to be better. And I'm sure there are some people like James Steele who look at this and be like, "Wow, that was like too, or maybe at least just me, like one ape trying to explain a monolith." But at least we were hopefully not wrong. That's the only hope I have for anyone who's watching, and hopefully it was helpful because thinking about these things after my PhD, ironically, after getting a doctorate of philosophy, has made me a lot better than I anticipated. And it's not something I even knew to value in the first place. So I see it the same way, dude.
Oh man, so beautiful to hear. And thanks, my man, Coleman. He was. I can see her coming. Well, there it is.
Yes.
Thanks to all of the people that got with us. Thanks to you, Eric. Thanks a lot. I cannot thank you enough ever. So anyway, I don't want to take any more of your time. I'm gonna upload this in a couple of weeks to YouTube with so people can put it can activate subtitles and hopefully get a little bit of the jewels that you presented to us.
My pleasure. I can't wait for that to go up. I'll definitely share it, my man. Thank you so
Thanks for
much.
taking the time, man. Hope you have a great rest of the day.
You too, man. Take care.